Hello and welcome to the Northern Saga Russian History Podcast. I'm Alexander.
And I'm Philip.
So, do you want to talk about what we're going to be discussing today?
Yes, so today we're going to be discussing not Cold War doctrine, but Soviet World War II doctrine. And basically like how they waged war against the Germans and such. And of course, before we begin this, we want to issue a small disclaimer. This is a podcast that is done purely for fun between two guys who are interested in Russian history. This is in no way a legitimate source. Almost everything we talk about is found either on Wikipedia or dubious Russian sources. So,
and we are extremely biased.
Yeah, we're extremely biased.
We are going to say very offensive things.
Yeah, possibly.
Possibly.
Yeah, but of course, if you have constructive criticism or just want to flame in the comments, feel free to do so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have thick skin, it's fine.
Of course. So, anyway, Soviet World War II doctrine. Now, we're going to start with this with a little bit of hard love. Right, Alexander?
Okay, yes.
Yeah. So, when you think of Soviet World War II doctrine, you're probably thinking of German propaganda.
That's what you've been sold for all these years, from all the movies you've been watching and the games you've been playing.
Exactly. And, more or less throughout history is written by the victors, except when it comes to the Soviet Union in the Second World War.
It's almost maybe the Germans were the real victors all along. Whoa.
Ooh, maybe Hitler escaped to Argentina.
Okay, that was a spicy meatball. Let's continue.
Yeah, as mentioned earlier, this is in no way a legitimate source, okay?
Yes.
So, either way. But seriously, let's talk about the depiction of the Soviets during the Second World War in media, right? Especially in Western media. There's this often, I'd say, erroneous misconception about the Soviets being very, how should I say this? Just like throw a bunch of conscripts against the wall.
Lax with human lives.
What?
Very lax with human lives.
Yeah, exactly, and very they were very eager to expend a lot of their conscripts and a lot of their soldiers, and in fact, I'm going to admit this, a lot of this is actually grounded in reality, right? Especially during the early stages of the war. However, this is in no way representative of the Soviet armed forces as a whole and their overall performance in the entire war, especially towards the end of the war, right?
Yes.
When the Germans were on the retreat and the Soviets were advancing. So, sorry. Pardon. So, what I want to start with is maybe to discuss how this misconception came to being, right? So, so when we think of the start of the war on the Eastern Front, we think of Operation Barbarossa, right? With the Germans invading the Soviet Union, and Operation Barbarossa was, overall it didn't reach its goal, obviously, but It started out extremely successfully, right? We saw the Soviets being encircled by the millions, and we also saw the Soviets being on a massive retreat, right? We saw massive casualties on the Soviet side, very minimal casualties, relatively speaking, on the German side. And we saw the Germans taking a lot of land in a relatively short amount of time, right? And this is due to many factors. One factor is that the Soviets were taking almost completely off guard, with Germany breaking the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact very, very swiftly and very unexpectedly by the Soviets. And also, the Soviets were in the middle of the Soviet Red Army, or the Red Army was in the middle of a massive reorganization, right? Especially its tank armies. They were. I don't remember the entire I don't remember the specifics of it, but point is they were reorganizing, and they were about halfway done reorganizing when the Germans attacked.
Did a lot of it be because of all of the army officers who just decided to go on a very long vacation?
Yeah, on a very long vacation in the building where a lot of people go in but not go out as much. Right. Yes, I almost forgot to say that. A lot of the Red Army officers were purged, and a purged army doesn't fight nearly as well as a non-purged army does.
And probably a lot of the old guard had died off because a lot of the people had the last legitimate war was in the Russian Civil War and the First World War before that. So
Right.
probably a lot of the generals who had experience from that time had gone off on a pension or died.
Exactly, and also a lot of the officers were actually remnants of White Army officers, right? Even those who haven't been purged. So what you had a very not only bureaucratic but frankly inefficient, or I mean they're basically one and the same, but a very inefficient system in managing and keeping these officers in check with the form of political officers or commissars, right? In which a commissar he had almost absolute power over every decision of the officer. So he in theory he could override anything a former White Army officer had to say, right? So that led to very many that led to numerous failures on the front, right? And so I'd say that and it is during this period where we truly saw a lot of disregard for Soviet life, like from the Red Army side.
Right.
And also a lot of the stereotypical throw a bunch of conscripts at the Germans and see what happens kind of things, right?
Would you say that a lot of it was due to Stalin himself and the kind of orders he gave to the political officers?
I'd say not maybe Stalin directly, but
No.
at the very least the political officers, yes,
Yeah.
definitely. Because a lot of the White Army officers, they insisted on retreating, right? Because they saw situation as it was, right?
They were being attacked by a larger force, frankly, and they didn't have the resources to defend.
Exactly, not the resources, not the officers, they were poorly organized as a result of that reorganization. So they saw retreat as something that was, preferable to just dishing it out. And
Yeah, there is such a thing as strategic retreat.
exactly, and a lot of the commissars were against it because they saw it as an act of cowardice, or they saw it as them trying to undermine the Soviets, right?
Yeah.
And that's a particularly specific example, but it really comes to show what the mindset of the commissars was, right? And this friction between the officers and the policies, right? And the political part of the Red Army. So towards the end of the war, not the war, but towards the end of 1941, the beginning of 1942, the German army it kind of it slows down a bit, right? Partly due to winter, right? But also in large part because they overextended their logistical lines, right?
It's almost like Russia is slightly bigger than the rest of Europe.
Exactly, and it's almost as if it's kind of erroneous to model the invasion of Russia after the invasion of France, right?
Yeah, France, a very densely populated, frankly small country.
Exactly. So, and really, this is the period where we see true Soviet doctrine come into fruition, right? This is where the Soviets they have a bit of breathing space, right? They have some time to reorganize. They have some time to, have a little breather. Think about the situation a bit, and really apply themselves, right?
Yeah.
And it is really in 1942 where we see a big remobilization, and it is in 1943, 1944 where we see the full extent of the Soviet army, right?
Yeah, that's the great push the other way.
Right, exactly, and I'd say that this is the period that is most representative of the Soviet army, right? Because a lot of people they still thought that the Soviets they just threw a bunch of men at the Germans and just saw what happened, right? That wasn't the case, and what we saw there was an implementation of Soviet World War II doctrine, otherwise known as deep battle.
And just to confirm this, if they had continued with disregard for human life and no good doctrine, they wouldn't have been able to push back.
Exactly. So, saying that it's kind of weird to say that the Germans were better than the Soviets when it was the Soviets who beat them. You could say that it was a two-front war, which definitely had an effect. This isn't to say that the Americans or our Western allies did any worse or didn't do a less significant job in defeating the Germans. No, not at all. It's just that unfortunately the perception of the Red Army is one that is very it's of a very disorganized force and a very unequipped one.
Yeah, and this is a turning point in military history, right?
Exactly.
No one really knows how a war is going to be fought. The Germans kind of just did a thing, and that thing went well, and now everyone is trying to catch up with the thing.
Exactly, and that thing Germany did is what many people refer to now as Blitzkrieg. Blitzkrieg is a very it's a I wouldn't say a misnomer. It's a term that didn't exist right back then.
It might not. A term cannot not no. A term, it might still exist as a term, but might not be representative of what you associate with it.
Exactly, and but the thing is, Blitzkrieg wasn't really an official term within German doctrine, right?
Was it just give the soldiers meth and see what happens?
Yeah, basically, it's that's a completely other thing. What Blitzkrieg really was, it was a, and still is, it's a buzzword, right?
Okay.
It's just it's just some, right now it just refers to overall like German military doctrine, but back then it really didn't mean anything, right? It wasn't a part of German military glossary, right?
Oh.
So, but what we really mean by Blitzkrieg is the German is what the Germans call the Bewegungskrieg, right? Or maneuver warfare, basically. And what this revolved around is you had, let me see, I have a couple of notes here because this is not a, this is a very hard topic not to have notes about. But what the Germans had is that they, what this Bewegungskrieg emphasized, right, is that it was, it emphasized winning single engagements on the tactical level, right? Let me just explain the difference between tactics and strategy.
That's probably
right?
smart, yeah.
Yeah, so strategy is like your overall goal, right? So let's say that the German strategy in World War II was to take over, or on the Eastern Front was to take over Moscow, right?
Yeah.
Tactics, really like, basically, it's everything you do to achieve that goal, right?
Yeah.
Basically. I mean, there's a lot more nuance to this, but if you want to think about it this way, tactics is like the small battles, right? The battles that you win on the front, and strategy is what you want. Like,
so essentially, strategy is how you want the war to progress. Tactics is how you want the battles to progress, or how you try to progress the battles.
Exactly. You can also look at it this way: strategy, it occurs on a much larger scale, right?
Of course.
When you think about strategy, you think about your own economy, you think about your overall manpower, you think about your industrial capacity, right? When you think about tactics, on the other hand, you think about the individual battles, right? You think about how, how much armor your tanks have, how fast they are, how good your men are at fighting, like so on, right? So you could say that tactics, it's on a much smaller scale and on a much finer scale than what strategy is.
Yeah, but you can have very good tactics, but poor strategy, and still lose a war.
Exactly, and I'd argue that's what the Germans had, right?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, they perfected, or almost perfected at least, tactical engagements, right? They were extremely good at it, right? But they kind of failed to take like the more broad scope into perspective.
Yeah, because you can win as many battles as you want, but like I believe Sun Tzu said that only fight a battle when you know you gain something from winning it.
Exactly.
And the Germans didn't really understand that concept.
Exactly, and really this is reflected in how Operation Barbarossa played out. It's like, instead of having an overall strategic goal, of course you could say Moscow was one.
Wasn't it like the Arkhangelsk-Astrakhan line that was their overall goal?
Yeah, I guess you could say that, right? They did have a goal, right? But they didn't really do much about it. What they did instead is that they tried to encircle as many Soviet army units as possible, right?
Yeah, which is probably sounds like a smart idea at the time, because that means less armies to fight them.
Exactly. I mean, no, it's by no means a bad idea, right?
No.
It's just that they did this without really considering the broader picture, right? And you understand what I mean, right? They didn't really consider the wider scope, right? And this is also reflected in German army. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here, but this is also reflected in the German Bewegungskrieg, right? Or in their doctrine at the time, that they emphasized on winning many small engagements, right? Decisively winning them, right? And they also, that was like their emphasis, right? And they did this by, they did this primarily by enveloping, right? By surrounding them, right? By surrounding enemy units, and
which sort of in this context is probably the only way you can utterly destroy an enemy.
Exactly, and what this looked like in practice is that they would try to, if you imagine a Soviet line, right?
Okay.
A Soviet line of defense, or an enemy line of defense, for that matter. They would try to find a weak point in that line, right? And what they would do is that they would attack that weak point with armor, right? With tanks.
Yeah, this is like breakthrough doctrine.
Yeah, basically. And when that armor has exploited it, or not exploited it, but created an even bigger weak point, then you'd have infantry rushing through that weak point and then enveloping, right, the enemy.
Yeah, because this is, goes all the way back to the Breslov offensive and later shock troop doctrine in World War One, which is you focus overwhelming force on a weak point and then you push as many infantry as you can into the weak point and then attack the rest of the lines from behind in a way.
Exactly. You envelop them and then yeah, exactly. You take your reserve infantry, you plow them through that weak point, and then you basically envelop the enemy formation, right? And you're done.
Yeah.
That's the German.
How to win a war in 3 easy steps.
Yeah, by Adolf Hitler. Yeah. So that's like the German way of doing things, right? And this is, for, I'd say for a good reason. This is very emphasized in modern history, in Western history at least, because this is essentially how the Germans managed to conquer all of Europe, all of Western Europe at least, with France and Poland and...
Because France was if you think it was the biggest army in Europe at the time,
right?
And the German army at that point was surprisingly small, smaller than you might imagine.
Yeah, exactly, and no one really surprised the German army to be good, considering the Treaty of Versailles and all the limitations there.
It's almost as if a piece of paper is worthless if you can't enforce it.
Exactly. Okay, but either way, we're getting a little out of hand here, right?
Yeah.
So that was the German way of doing things, and what is often forgotten is how the Soviets approached this, right? How the Soviets approached this doctrine, and what the Soviets emphasize.
Wow, that's deep.
Deep battle. Well, let's ease off on the bad puns, okay?
No more bad puns. I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure. No problem. But how the Soviets did this is it was in many ways similar, right, to the Germans. Both doctrines they heavily emphasized armor, like the use of mechanized formations and this focus on mobility, right, and quickly exploiting breakthroughs, right, and weak points. But the difference is, I say that the biggest conceptual difference is that Blitzkrieg, while it exploits weaknesses, deep battle, i.e. the Soviet doctrine, it creates them.
Yes.
Right. It assumes that the enemy formation is perfect. However, then it seeks to create a weakness, right? And
well, that would be likely by in a similar manner by using overwhelming force on a point.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's how they would do it, right? They would by the way, I failed to mention this, but the Germans, they would try to focus everything on a single point, right? Whereas the Soviets, given their obvious manpower advantage, they would try to create multiple points along the front, right?
Yeah, because for all you know, the enemy might be faking a weak point and then just envelop your envelopment.
Exactly, and also a very something that was a very big brain of the Soviets is that now the Germans, they don't know where to commit their reserves. Yes. Or if they were to commit all of their reserves to all points, they would be extremely spread out, right?
Yeah, which is the best way to fight an enemy with fewer resources than you.
Exactly. So, given the Soviets' manpower advantage, they would also organize their formations into echelons, right? So, you had the first echelon, right, which was comprised mainly of infantry formations, and then you had what was called a second echelon, which was comprised mostly of mechanized and mobile formations, right? And what the first echelon would do is that they were the ones who created weaknesses, right? They were the ones who attacked first, and the second echelon, they would be the ones who exploited those weaknesses, right? So,
yeah,
yeah.
But it's sort of opposite of the German doctrine in a way, because the German doctrine would first create or exploit the weakness with the armor and motorized, and then envelop with the infantry.
Exactly, and here we also see the differing points of like focus points of the two doctrines, right? Whereas the Germans focused very much on tactical victories, the Soviets, on the other hand, they focused very much on the strategic part of things, right?
Yeah.
So let's think about this, right? Infantry, right? There's a lot more of them than armor.
Obviously.
And they're better at standing their ground, but they're not as mobile as armor, right? Not nearly as mobile.
Not unless you put them in a car.
Exactly. but that wasn't really the case of much armories, unfortunately. There, but either way, but armor, they're of course they're armored, so they can take a hit. Yeah,
Yeah.
and they're extremely good at creating weaknesses, right? Or at the like the Germans did, right?
Yeah, you get this sort of tank shock effect, which is very hard to defend against.
Exactly. And but what the Germans did, right, is that they only enveloped, right, that formation with infantry. But however, if the infantry is the ones who are exploiting, they can't really reach deep into the enemy formation, right?
No, and you're kind of leaving yourself weak to a counterattack.
Exactly. Now this is where the name Deep Battle comes from, right? Because if it's the armor who exploits the weakness, then they can drive all the way back into enemy formations, right? All the way back into the enemy rear, and there, where all the communications are, and the storage depots are, and all the logistics.
All the stuff where you don't want an enemy tank.
Yeah, exactly. All the stuff where you don't want the enemies to be. That's where the Soviets were, and that's what the Soviets tried to do. Is they try to destroy the enemy from the rear, right? By destroying their logistics and all of their communications and whatnot.
In this, isn't there a certain risk of getting your own exploding tanks enveloped through that doctrine?
Not if there's no one to envelop them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, of course, they won't drive like... They won't drive to absurd lengths right behind the enemy.
The point is, the Germans, even if they copied this doctrine, they wouldn't be able to use it because they wouldn't have the numbers.
Exactly. You need manpower here, right? Yeah. You need a large manpower. This is like the whole gist of things, right? So either way, we got very carried away there. Yeah. I want to explain how this really worked.
I'm
right?
sorry.
Yeah, no problem, no problem. This is what we're here for, right? This is basically just a rambling podcast.
It's just a rambling.
Yeah. So either way, the Soviets, they tried to create, or they created weaknesses in the enemy line using infantry, right? Infantry and artillery. That's like the that's like the.
And they made some big guns.
They made some very big guns. The B4, I think it was 203.
Oh, the B4 is really cool.
Yeah, it's really cool. Yeah, so it's a really big gun basically. But infantry and artillery. That's like the bread and butter of Soviet doctrine, right? That's what you do. That's what you use to create weaknesses. And of course, infantry is worse at creating weaknesses than tanks are.
Obviously.
Right? So that that kind of implies a higher rate of casualties among the Soviet sides, right? And what you can do with armor is that you can, as I mentioned earlier, you can much more easily exploit the weakness, right? And you can drive into the enemy rear and like wreak havoc on their logistics.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what the Soviets did basically. You create a weakness, or you create a weak point with using infantry. If you can't create a weak point, you make the enemy retreat, right? Thus creating a weak point.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you commit your armor reserves, right? You commit them, and then they exploit the enemy rear.
Yeah, and then you can do a lot of damage.
You can do a lot of damage, and here I want to, I just want to give some examples, right? So, I say that one of the best examples of deep battle doctrine being put to its fullest, right, to the full effect, is Operation Bagration, right? Which took place in 1944, and again, this is I'd say this is at the peak of the Soviet Army, or the Red Army during World War II, right? In 1944, sorry. Speaking a little fast here. And basically what happened is that they managed to occupy, or liberate, occupy,
Tomato.
Yeah, tomato, yes. Upwards of 800 to 1,000 kilometers of German territory in the span of what's this now? In the span of 2 months, 2 to 3 months. And which is really quite impressive.
That's like half. If you take Norway and you like put it on its height, that's like half.
Exactly, and it's really quite a lot. And I'd say that this is the perception we have to have of the Soviet military, right?
Yeah.
A highly mechanized, organized force, right? One to be reckoned with. Not one where you just throw a bunch of conscripts at the Germans.
Because it wasn't really well defined as an army during Operation Barbarossa. That's the point you're trying to make.
Yeah, that's the point I'm trying to make. And also, you had a lot of the officers were purged, and
Went on a vacation.
yeah. No, I'm sorry. We have to keep this criminal friendly, otherwise we don't get our stipend.
No.
But yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, it was in the midst of massive reorganization, and so yeah, it was really ill-equipped to fight a force such as the Germans. So yeah, this basically was deep battle doctrine. Yeah, not really much to say here.
No, or maybe you want to talk about some of the pioneers of deep battle.
Yeah, I could probably talk about a bit about the history.
Yeah.
So to do so, we have to go. Deep battle doctrine itself, it was it was a Soviet invention, right?
Yes.
The deep battle in of itself. However, we see a lot of it. We can at least see a hint of it during the First World War, right?
Yeah.
With the Brusilov offensive, right? In which you had I don't remember his rank, right? It was either general or.
He was a general, wasn't
he? Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
By the name of Brusilov, right?
Yeah.
And he commanded Russian forces. I believe it was on the Eastern Front, right?
Yeah. In the East Front in World War One, and it was basically a few moments where instead of just rushing their soldiers forward for political favor and completely disregard for lives, they actually did something tactical and succeeded.
Exactly. It was, I believe, it was against the Austrian-Hungarians, right? Yeah.
Although the Germans had to help their Austrian friends.
Yeah. But so the Germans were there, right? So basically, what this you have to like recall what the Eastern Front of World War One looked like, right? It was a stalemate, right? Pretty much.
The Eastern Front was, I think, surprisingly mobile
compared to the Western Front.
Compared to the Western Front.
Yeah. I mean, the Western Front is as stale as it gets, right?
Yeah.
But the Eastern Front, it was more mobile, but it was also there wasn't really that much progress, especially on the Russian side.
No, there was mostly just people dying.
Exactly. I mean, as with all wars.
But particularly the Eastern Front in World War One was particularly diable, murderous.
Yeah, exactly. So Brusilov, he wanted to do something about this, right?
Yeah, and and as all the allies in World War One saw that, Germany had sort of a soft underbelly in Austria-Hungary.
Yeah, exactly. Like Germany with the Schlieffen Plan, they were like, okay. So France, Britain, the West is important. The East, Russia. Who cares? Yeah.
No, actually, this is interesting. A bit of a off topic, but the Germans believed that the Russians would be the much greater threat than France. So this is why they rushed all their troops to try and take out France early.
Okay.
But so they only left a skeleton force in the east. But they completely overestimate the Russian forces, and their skeleton force was able to make significant gains.
Oh, right. Okay, I didn't know that.
Yep, because you need some context here. The Russian army was considered the biggest, most powerful army in Europe for hundreds of years.
Right.
Like the Russo-Japanese War and the Crimean War sort of started to poke holes in that, but the Germans still recognized it as a mighty feared army and didn't realize that it was barely equipped and trained at this
exactly.
point.
Right. So, the Russo-Japanese War is something we'll get back to later, actually. So, but the Brusilov offensive was a surprisingly successful offensive by the Russians, right? In which you had this, General Brusilov come up with this plan, right?
I get no recognition. Rip.
Yeah, poor him. But either way, here we saw one of the earliest, I'd say, examples of applied breakthrough doctrine.
Yeah.
Right? In which he emphasized the use of shock troops in order to create and exploit weaknesses.
And this is, essentially modern warfare in its simplest form.
Basically. Of course, when tanks came along and they started to become more viable, right, than they were in, the First World War, they were applied to this exploitation and breakthrough doctrine. And it also came along the use of self-propelled and a more rapid-firing artillery, right, for example. And... but the Brusilov offensive, I'd say it's pretty erroneous to say that it was a direct predecessor to deep battle doctrine.
But it inspired both I would say it inspired both Blitzkrieg and deep battle, because the Germans would copy those tactics on the Western Front in the famous German shock troops, who, also fun fact, a lot of the Nazi party members were former shock troops, and a lot of the similarities between their way of thinking. But
exactly. It's definitely, I'd say it's correct to say that was certainly an inspiration, but it wasn't, I'd say, an evolution of it.
No.
Because there's a very big difference between the Brusilov doctrine and deep battle in one part, and that is the use of artillery. Brusilov offensive, it emphasized short and accurate bombardments of artillery as to take the enemy by surprise, right? And as to, keep this initiative and the factor of surprise, right? Whereas deep battle, it emphasized a very slow and creeping barrage of artillery in order to wear the enemy down and indeed to create a weakness.
Yeah, and of course, like we said earlier, it wouldn't build on the Brusilov doctrine because he didn't get any recognition.
Exactly. So, yeah, right. So,
he was a general, not a politician, which is why he got kind of screwed.
Exactly, and when the Soviets came to power, I don't know what happened to him then.
He essentially just immediately said, "Okay, I'm switching sides. I don't have any allegiance," and he died alone in an apartment in St. Petersburg.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's kind of anticlimactic for someone who.
Quite anticlimactic.
Yeah. So that was Brusilov, and but Soviet deep battle doctrine really came into. It really began to become a thing during the 30s or late 20s, I'd say, because you had a lot of military flops on both the Russian Imperial and the Soviet side. First of all, you had the Russo-Japanese War, in which we saw the Russians get kicked their teeth in by the Japanese, mostly on the naval part.
Yeah,
right? But
and that was a lot just due to overconfidence.
Exactly, and the Russians send their ships around Africa because the Suez Canal got closed for them.
Around the world in a couple of days with the Russian Navy.
Yeah, exactly, and that didn't really go so well. Of course, that as mentioned earlier, it was more of a naval defeat than a military
It was also a land defeat.
Well, it was also a land defeat, but the naval defeat is much more emphasized and memeable. But But that kind of nudged them into the direction that, hey, maybe we need a more cohesive and better doctrine, right, suited for a modern battlefield.
Right, and it will also help if the soldiers had guns.
Exactly, and also World War I, we saw many Russian military failures despite the Brusilov offensive.
Yeah, and there's lots of parallels between Russia in World War I and Soviet Union at the start of Operation Barbarossa. In both cases, you had under-organized, under-equipped troops who were being reorganized. Wait, I said organized twice, but that's not the point. Yeah. And officers vying for political supremacy and too much political influence in the army to make it actually effective.
Exactly. Yeah, we see kind of a crossroads here. The army often has a lot of influence on the political side of things, while the politics have a lot of influence on the army side.
Yeah, so the difference between the two is that, the Russians in World War I never really learned, except Brusilov, because he didn't get any recognition.
Right.
While in World War II, they actually turned the entire thing around.
Exactly. Also, you had the dumpster fire that was the Polish-Soviet War.
Yeah. Who would win an entire Red Army or some boys on horses?
Exactly. Dumpster fire for the Soviets, that is. The Poles, they managed, I'd say, exceptionally well.
They earned themselves a decade or two of being alive.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, Jesus. Okay. So
sorry, Poles, for listening.
It's all in good faith. But either way, so the Soviets, they sat down and they were like, all right, we need a new doctrine and we need one fast, right? And the pioneer of deep battle was a certain marshal called Marshal Tukhachevsky, right? Yeah. If you've played Hearts of Iron, you may recognize his name in that you have to purge him.
Yeah.
That's exactly what happened. He got executed in 1937, and basically this development of deep battle, it was put on a hold, right? Just in time for the Germans to attack. So So
and here's some doctrine I prepared earlier.
yeah. So basically, the Soviet military leadership, they were like, "Hey, remember that marshal we killed a couple of years back? Maybe his writings on like a new and improved doctrine for the modern battlefield wasn't such of a bad idea, right?" So they basically took his writings and they, as I mentioned earlier, they perfected them in 1943 and 1944.
The only posthumously successful field marshal.
Exactly. Crushing Germans from the grave, right?
I don't even have to be alive to win.
Exactly. That's basically what happened. That's how Deep Battle really came into existence. That was through the combined effort, or maybe not combined effort, but some ideas from the Brazil offensive and the developments of, technological developments during the period, and of course Marshal Tukhachevsky. Yeah. So I'd say that's pretty much it. Maybe a shorter episode this time, but
yeah, we hope you have enjoyed, and will clear your mind of the implanted German propaganda.
Yeah, in the most awkward and improvised way possible.
Yeah, and
so yeah, have a nice day. I'd say.
Have a nice day. We hope you have enjoyed listening, but don't take anything we say seriously because we don't even know what we're talking about ourselves.
Yeah, but we're like rambling half the time anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.